Hey guys, I wanted to give you sort of an overview of text and how to work with letter spacing, kerning, tracking, how to get your text to be used across different formats, like for example PDFs, and how to get your text to kind of look like an object, like a logo, rather than just typed out text. So by default, each bit of text that you type in will have its own font size, kerning, and leading, and the ability to track in between each letter. As you see your fonts get bigger and bigger, you're going to see that the spacing becomes more and more. And that's just kind of relative to the size that you're viewing it at. So when fonts are really small like this, you'll notice you don't notice that space as much. And so when you're typing in body text, you don't really notice spacing so much the smaller it gets. So it doesn't bother you that you might have a big space between these two O's or between the L and the O. And so it's not always required to adjust the tracking, although sometimes when you have publications like a newspaper, you might want to compress this a little bit so you can fit more text in. As a general rule, we don't compress the text, like distort it horizontally or vertically. You can get away with a little bit on certain applications, but as a general rule, you kind of leave it the way it is. And you can adjust letter spacing and word spacing as you need. Okay, so this looks fine as body text, but what if we have a logo that we're trying to create? Well, you can see that there's a lot of space in between here. And what happens is when the viewer looks at this, your eye is kind of going in between. So right away, if you're going to create a logo, you kind of should tighten it up a little bit. So already I've gone minus 40. Okay, and already look at this. It's starting to look like it's together. It's starting to look more like a logo. And you can get even closer. So when they design fonts, it's really hard to get a letter to match up perfectly with every letter that it might be next to. So that kind of tells you whether or not a font was really developed over the years and by a professional, or something that you might find on DaFont, where a lot of fonts are just kind of created with a certain look, but they don't have a lot of concern for how letters sit next to each other. Okay, so these letters, this is Myriad Pro. It's a great font, and you can see that it was developed really well because there's not much to have to adjust here. But as you can see now, all of a sudden I have a logo that I can kind of already see as one object. So we're going to talk about Gestalt principles in a second, so you can really see what that means. But we start seeing this together and not just as text that was typed out, right? So this is the text typed out with no tracking at all. And you can kind of see how it's a little bit bigger. It's not as together as the one we kind of just adjusted. Okay, so that's kind of number one when you start looking at text, using text in graphic designs for whatever you're going to do, even for video, even for video applications. Really look at how letters fit next to each other. Once you start looking at this, you're always going to notice when people haven't looked at, taken a second look at the letter spacing. Now, what if you have a font that is kind of irregular and you're going to send that to a client? Well, let's just take, for example, Goodland, or how about Museo Modano. This is kind of a unique font. Not everybody's going to have this. So what you want to do is you want to take this font, once you're done using the developing the logo or whatever it is, and you might want to always save a copy so that you have this somewhere in text format. But once you get a a style and a font that you're going to use and you want to send it to a client, or you want to use it in a different application, you typically want to outline it. So I'm going to outline this twice. Okay. Oh, I'm just going to create outlines. Sorry. It just created outlines for the whole thing. And then what you can do is, if you want to outline it twice, then you can start moving these a little bit closer. Maybe you want to just kind of inch this over just a little bit, pixel by pixel, to try to get these things to go closer together, right? You can either, and I'm selecting the whole thing. I'm using the object selection tool, so the entire selection tool. So you might want to use, break this apart again. So if I go here and I could ungroup it, right? Object, I just ungrouped it. So it's either grouped or it's ungrouped. And now if I select on one letter, I can move those individually. So I'm going to move this over just a tiny little bit. You see it's starting to tighten up just a little. You see how this O is a little bit further out? Okay, so now we're getting this logo to be much tighter. Look at that. Okay. If I were to type this again, and let's say I have a couple of different words. Okay, let's say I have 3 words here, just some fake words. And then I do create outlines again. I can break this apart again here, ungroup. And if I want to do my letter spacing a little closer, my word spacing, then I can kind of just jump those over a little bit. So let's say I wanted a tiny space in between these 2 words. So then I can kind of keep the space, but not as big as it was before. And then I can start moving individual letters into place so that it becomes a little tighter overall. You see that? And I'm going to move this one over. Okay. So how does this all relate to the Gestalt studies on how people perceive things as unified or not unified? Well, when objects are closer together, like they are, the letters in this logo, we see it as a full object. If they were apart, if this was apart, like this, we start to see through the middle and they become separate objects. So this doesn't look like a logo anymore, right? Okay, so let's look at a couple examples of this. We could say this is the AAA logo for auto service, auto rescue. And so what would happen if they had the A's all separate? Well, they all look like they're separate objects. They don't belong together. But then if we put them together, all of a sudden it becomes one object. And this on your page, that A would become one object rather than, disparate objects across the design. Here are 3 shapes that are put together closely. And when you zoom out and you look at them, you look at this as one object. It almost looks like a person laying down because it kind of has a head here. And these could be the legs, right? But if you separate them, then they all become separate objects. So we're talking about proximity here. It's one of the principles of the Gestalt study that show that objects, when they're closer together, we view as one object. And this becomes really important in designs, especially graphic designs, where you don't want to have too many objects on the page because you might have to deliver a message. So rather than having these 3 objects together, if they belong together in a message, then you could put them together and then the viewer would read them that way. So anyway, so that's about a little bit of talk about how to develop logos and create objects. We'll see you next time.